very warm welcome. I'm Stan Grant. We're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight. Joining me on the panel, Research Fellow at the Lowy Institute, Jennifer Sue, Minister for International Development and the Pacific, Pat Conroy, who's just returned from the Solomon Islands, Shadow Minister for Cyber Security and Countering Foreign Interference, James Paterson, Australian Bureau Chief at the New York Times, Damien, and live from Brussels, Head of the International Trade and Union Confederation, Sharan Burrow. Please make them welcome.
Tensions are high with the Taiwan-China situation. Does the panel genuinely believe that China will escalate things? China may be forceful, but they don't do things rashly. So aren't they just flexing their muscles prior to their 20th Party Congress that will occur later this year? I ask this as someone who has lived and worked in the region.
Thanks, Julian. Pat Conroy.
Oh, well, thanks, Stan, and thank you for the excellent question. I can't engage in hypotheticals about what will happen in the future, but what I can say is it's in the interest of everyone in the region for de-escalation to occur now. We need restraint, and we need to really focus on a peaceful and prosperous region where we respect and honour the status quo that is there at the moment. The Australian government's position is there should be no unilateral change to the status quo, and there's a bipartisan commitment to the One China policy.
Pat, just after the appearance of the Chinese ambassador at the National Press Club this week, where clearly there were red lines, we will not compromise over Taiwan, he said, all necessary measures will be taken, reiterating what we've heard from Xi Jinping about the potential use of force to, as the Communist Party sees it, reunify Taiwan with the mainland. I'm wondering how that changes Australia's relationship with China, given that there were signs potentially of a thaw. Does that now put things on the back foot again?
Well, I was concerned, like many people, by some of the language used by the ambassador yesterday. And we have been seeking to stabilise the relationship because that's in the interest of both China and Australia. But what is essential at the moment is that de-escalation occur, the heat comes out of the tensions that are there. But let me repeat again that the Australian government's policy is that there can be no unilateral change to the status quo. That's essential, and as I said, the language there was a bit concerning. We just have to move past it. Australia will always stick up for its values and interests, but where we can cooperate with China, we will. Where we disagree, we will do that as well.
James Paterson, Taiwan has always been a flashpoint. 1996, things got very close to a conflict, but now it seems to be ramped up even further. Why are we seeing this change?
Well, to come directly back to Sulian's question, the late American poet Maya Angelou had a wonderful phrase that when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. And the Chinese Communist Party has not just shown us once who they are, they've shown us who they are in Tibet, they've shown us who they are in Xinjiang, they've shown us who they are in Hong Kong, they are showing us again who they are in Taiwan. And the ambassador at the press club yesterday showed us again who they are, and we should believe him. They are very serious when they say all options are on the table and that we should use our imagination to think about what they might do. And it doesn't require much imagination to think about what they might do. And we should believe them when they say that re-education of the 23 million free people of Taiwan is something that they have planned for after taking Taiwan. And we should treat that very seriously as Australia. I agree with everything that Pat said, and the opposition completely backs the government and the government's handling of this issue, and we completely back the 50-year bipartisan One China policy of Australia. But as a country, we need to be doing everything we can to contribute to our allies' collective efforts to discourage a unilateral and forceful change to the status quo.
Sulian, can I come back to you? Is that how you see things? Do you believe that what we are seeing with the increased war games over Taiwan and the increased rhetoric, the real face of the Communist Party of China?
I lived in Hong Kong, so I was sort of at the end of my time in Hong Kong, that was the rise of the umbrella revolution, right? It happened on my doorstep. But I don't know. It's really hard because I didn't think that was going to happen in Hong Kong, right?
The umbrella movement, or what came after the crackdown?
What has come.
Right.
But at the same time, you know, I'm of Chinese heritage, so we have this saying about saving face, right? And so I think what's happened in recent days, in a way, that is China, you know, it sort of responding to the US and Nancy Pelosi's visit, right? So I just don't think that they will be rash as to actually start war and an outright invasion of Taiwan. I just think that's going too far. And particularly with the current economic environment over there, right? It just doesn't make sense.
Jennifer, is that how you see it?
So I'd like us to think a little bit differently about the situation by placing Taiwan and its people, the Taiwanese, at the centre of the conversation, because I think a lot of the media coverage that we've seen over the last 2 weeks have really centred on US-China. There's an island of 23 million people whose voice we haven't heard. What do they want? How do they see their futures? And I think earlier this year, the Brookings Institution released survey findings to say 82% of Taiwanese want some form of status quo. That's a huge number. So, and a lot of Taiwanese commentators over the last 2 weeks have said, you know, people are getting on with their everyday lives in Taiwan. World War III is not imminent.
The status quo does not mean Taiwanese independence, because that's always been the line, hasn't it? That the status quo holds. Taiwan does not seek independence. The Communist Party, the PRC, does not seek to change that balance. That's what you're saying that the people would like to see remain.
Yeah, so I think Taiwanese, by and large, do not want to be in this military tensioned situation. They have a voice. They're a liberal democracy, it's vibrant, their civil society is active, and a lot of things have come to the fore because of that interaction between the democratic institutions and the civil society of Taiwan, irrespective of what China is doing. So I think those are the things that we ought to be focusing on.
It's interesting you mentioned status quo, though, and that's something that came up, too, because in the conversations that I've had with military experts and officials in various countries, one of the things that needs to be recognized is that China has changed the status quo by its response to Nancy Pelosi's visit. There were missiles that dropped in Japanese waters in their exclusive economic zone. Some of the missiles flew over Taiwan. They were in an area that they haven't been before. And so I think one of the concerns that a lot of people have is even if this doesn't go all the way toward invasion, it's moving the line. It's changing the status quo and creating a dynamic where it can be more militarized more often. And so the standard of what's acceptable Chinese behavior has now just moved.
Does that then bring the clock forward as well? Because China is increasing its military capacity, Damien. Does that then raise questions about countries like the United States, Australia will be brought into that as well, to be able to resist that or support Taiwan in the event that there is hostility?
Well, I think that's still the big unanswered question, right? Is this part of the conversation has been about China versus the U.S. because I don't think anyone anticipates that Taiwan on its own would be able to defend against China, especially with its military and how much strength it's gained in the past few years. But in some ways, it goes beyond that, too. It's also about the allies in the region. And I think in some ways, this was a test case, not just for Taiwan, China, the United States, or even Australia. It's a test case for the entire Asia-Pacific region. Where are people going to line up? Where are countries going to line up? And I think it's still really unsettled. And this happens a lot when there's great power competition, if you look through history, where these unsettled moments are often the most scary moments.
Sharan, from where you sit in Europe, what's the view from there? Of course, there's a war underway in Ukraine, but watching the events in Taiwan as well. And if I can get you to factor this in as well, when you talk about China, you're also talking about an indispensable nation when it comes to the global economy, the biggest engine of economic growth. So there is so much hinging on this. How do you see it?
Well, you're right, Stan. You have more than 20% of the world's population, about a third of the world's workforce actually in China. And they are, for better or worse, part of the global economy. In a multipolar world where we're seeing fractures everywhere, there's a lot of posturing, but I want to return to, in fact, the point that if we don't put people, and I would add the environment, people and planet, at the heart of our strategic thinking, and base that strategic thinking on a commitment to telling the truth. I can't walk away from the fact that our unions have been dissolved in Hong Kong, that our leaders are in jail. Am I worried about Taiwan? Yes, we have members there. But we also know that unless there's a sense of a common security and it's backed out by critical, honest dialogue to try and find common ground, then we're just escalating with indeed the kind of language we saw yesterday from the ambassador. Although I want to make a point about that. I listened to it very carefully. And under the bellicose language, there actually was a commitment to dialogue with Australia, to re-engage, but also to a broader global environment around trade and settling trade disputes either through the WTO, that's a bit fractured right now as well, or bilaterally. So while we need to be very clear about our value set and about what human behaviour we can tolerate, and right now I'd just say the Uyghur people, forced labour, Hong Kong, at the same time, we would never argue that you don't engage with China because we have to find a common security for everybody, and it shouldn't be just about military security. That will not get us the distance we need to go.
As a Chinese Australian myself, I have felt the effects of the tumultuous COVID-19 pandemic and now rising tensions within the South China Sea. What can be done to destigmatise the Chinese Australian population?
Jennifer, the Lowy Institute's done some work around this, hasn't it? Tell us what it found.
So the Lowy Institute over the last 2 years have surveyed Chinese Australians and their sentiments on living in Australia, sense of belonging, a range of geopolitical issues, and also the state of bilateral relations. And we find in this year's survey that generally Chinese Australians feel a sense of belonging, although that has decreased since 2020, a general sense of belonging, pride in Australian life and culture. And I think these are all positive indicators of Chinese Australians' contribution and integration into Australian society. But yes, I would agree with you that over the last 2 years, due to COVID and pandemic lockdown, the sense of fragmentation has happened, in part due to discrimination, racism, when you've got former presidents or leaders of the world saying it's a China virus, so really stigmatising, giving it a geographic indicator. I think that doesn't help. It doesn't help Chinese Australians or Chinese Australian communities here. But I would say, there is potential positive points to look forward to. With the new government in power, there is signs of de-thawing between Australia and China relations. Obviously, that is all still very much on tenterhooks.
June, can I come back to you, just ask you, how have you experienced that? Have you personally experienced that, your family, the stigmatisation you've spoken about?
In general, I feel there's just a negative perception both in the schoolyard and in the media. And I fear that China's recent political actions will only compound this.
Because you mentioned COVID, and now, of course, we're seeing the tensions over Taiwan. Is that changing things? You say that could make it worse. Have you experienced that, seen that at all yet play out?
I do believe that it can make it worse, and I've seen certain circumstances which do show this. Yeah.
Well, Jennifer, when you look at that, what are the sort of things that people are telling you about that they have experienced? And I don't know whether you've experienced yourself personally either.
Well, I think the last 2 years have been terribly difficult. Yesterday at the Lowy Institute, we had a Migration Nation event talking about how multiculturalism can inform foreign policy making here in Australia. And I think one of the things that is missing in Australian society is that we haven't moved beyond celebrating the demographic reality that is Australia. The census over the last 5 or 10 years showed that Australia is becoming more multicultural, but we haven't moved beyond sort of that cultural aspect. What about integrating and institutionalising the voices of multicultural communities into policy making?
James Paterson, we've had instances where Chinese people have had their loyalty questioned or asked to almost pass a loyalty test when appearing at parliamentary committees. How do we differentiate between the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese people who are in China, and Chinese people in Australia?
Yeah, John, thank you for raising this issue. You're absolutely right too, and I've been concerned about this for some time. One of the first public interviews I gave after I became the Intelligence Committee Chair, I said that it is both morally wrong and counterproductive for Chinese Australians to be held culpable for the actions of the Chinese government. It's also wrong to hold the Chinese people culpable for the actions of the Chinese government because they had no say in picking that government. There was no vote which brought the Chinese Communist Party to power. It's morally wrong because it's not your fault, and it's counterproductive because we want Chinese Australians to feel just as much a part of the Australian community as everyone else and to be able to fully participate in that community. And I will always defend the right of Chinese Australians or any other Australian to have the freedom of speech and to participate in public debates. Whether you share my views on the geopolitical situation or whether you completely disagree with me, you have every right to be outspoken about those issues. And to stand your point, we have to be very careful about our language. We have to be very clear that we are saying that our dispute and our disagreement is with the Chinese Communist Party or the government of China. It is not with the Chinese people, and we have to re-emphasise that at every opportunity because the Chinese people are rightly very proud of the achievements of their civilisation. It's an amazing culture. There's been 200 years of migration of Chinese people to Australia, and they've massively enriched our country. And so we, as political leaders, have a special responsibility to bear to make sure that Chinese Australians can participate fully in public and political and social life.
But I was just going to say, I mean, the thing I think this is what you were raising too, is that the institutions of government and the institutions of Australia need to better reflect that diversity. I mean, even something as simple as language schools and language training, it's simply not as common to be learning other languages in Australia as in a lot of other countries. There are so many things that can be done at a very basic level for Australia to actually embrace its multiculturalism and frankly embrace the world in a way that it is yet to fully do.
俊，谢谢。我会说一点普通话，谢谢。
Good evening. Is capitalism actually destroying democracy?
Wow. Okay, Jennifer.
That's a very
I know,
philosophical.
it's always the simple questions that open up the biggest conversation.
But I think I would say, capitalism takes on many different forms, and the way the capitalist system has evolved over the last many centuries, where we are now, our workers, the people who work in different sectors, why is it that our educators, those who work in nursing homes, are paid the least when they are looking after the most vulnerable? Or our children, who are our future. So I think there's some perverse effects in capitalism, but I think Sharan Burrow will probably have a more articulate answer.
I will come to Sharan in just a minute, but Damien, you just came back from the United States, and there we are seeing all of this playing out, aren't we? That you see the rampant capitalism, it's the home of democracy, but we saw the protesters trashing the Capitol building. There is all the institutional rot that you talked about before and the tensions within the country. What does it say about the capacity for democracy to endure and capitalism to deliver?
I think capitalism is probably too broad a category, but one of the things that I did see in the United States that I think is not just apparent there, it's a growing problem in Australia too, is the power of inequality. The power of economic inequality to separate and create cleavages in society that are not healthy for democracy. And so in the United States, you have people who are not only divided by political party, they're increasingly divided by class, by belief, by style. One Republican Party will wear Wranglers, Democrats will wear Levi's. I mean, the cleavages are so deep, and yet we know statistically, and there's studies that have just come out recently showing that one of the keys to upward mobility is that you put people of different classes together. In the United States for a long time, in a lot of democracies, that was just a given. That's how it was. But unfortunately, late-stage capitalism, without guardrails and enough of a fight against inequality, creates systems where people just divide. And I think America's suffering those divisions right now.
And Sharan, how much of a threat to democracy globally is inequality?
Well, let me start with the model of economy. The global model of economy has failed working people. There's no doubt about that. Even in the region we live in, or our country lives in, I don't at the moment, then 94% of the workforce in the global supply chains are a hidden workforce. And it's been based on a model where, in fact, you exploited labour in order to make maximum profits. And we've seen the growth of billionaires that is just incomprehensible. But when you look at why that is, Stan, a couple of things. since the 1980s, the social contract's been broken. We've quadrupled our wealth, but we've seen Labor income share go down like a big dipper on a roller coaster, and people are in despair. You heard Jennifer talk about why we don't distribute our wealth better, pay the people we depend on. COVID showed us that. It was, of course, those in healthcare, in childcare, in education, in transport, logistics, retail. They're amongst the lowest paid, and the majority are women. And that is about inequality. But we also need governments to step up and look at their responsibility for a rules-based order, nationally and internationally, where we again regulate. We regulate labour markets, we regulate competition. If you look at the inflationary spikes right now in food, then you have about 4 companies globally controlling food production and distribution, despite all the millions of poor farmers. And the Cargill family, for example, 70% of control of that food, 12 new billionaires, and a profit last year that was the largest in its 156-year history, and in fact more will be this year, and they're not alone. I just picked them out because if you look at the 9 new billionaires from the pharmaceutical companies in the US alone during COVID, and in fact when America invested a lot of its own capital, as did other taxpayers' money, as did other countries, but didn't hold any IP, so we could get rid of the insidious vaccine nationalism. You know, we've got things out of whack, Stan, and I think unless people are prepared, and indeed Damien said it, look at reform of the multilateral system, but also come back and regulate the labour market. Our labour market is broken. 60% of the world's people work informally, no rights, no minimum wage, no rule of law, and that's not just in developing countries. So we can do better. We must do better, and it is about full employment. It's about wages that people can live on with dignity. It's about shared prosperity and universal social protection. And I was struck by the Chinese students' question because it's also about inclusion and equality, both gender and race. If we don't want to shape the world that we believe rests on our common values, then we will see more of the same.
There's a lot in that. There is a lot in that, Pat Conroy, and coming into government during the campaign, of course, Anthony Albanese had talked about delivering for wage earners. But now, of course, he has to face the reality, as he's already said, that wage growth may not keep up with inflation. We are already starting to see the types of inequality that Sharan Burrow talked about. There was a study from University of New South Wales that caught my eye. 130 billionaires in Australia hold as much wealth as the 3 million people in the lowest 30%. How do you deliver for those people that you promised to deliver for?
Well, we're delivering right now through a minimum wage increase, for example, which I'll talk about in a minute. But back to the original
That's still
question.
not going to keep pace,
I don't
is it?
think capitalism will destroy democracy, but inequality has that great potential. If people don't feel like they're invested in a system, why would they care about its existence? And that's what extreme inequality has a potential to do. And obviously this was a huge issue during the election campaign, and I remember many commentators and political opponents losing it when Anthony Albanese suggested a $1 an hour increase in the minimum wage.
But now he's admitting,
which we have delivered,
now he is admitting
that
wage rises can't keep up with inflation. That's likely to be the reality. You're going to have this jobs and skills summit. What are you looking to come out of that? Is that the sort of accord that we saw maybe during the Hawke-Keating years? How do you deliver on those things?
Well, what we're looking for is any constructive suggestions to improve our economic performance. You're absolutely right. We've got a couple of tough years ahead of us in terms of high inflation. Inflation that's been caused mainly by supply chain issues, particularly overseas, and that's why it's so important to diversify our economy and make us a bit more nationally independent from global supply chains so we can withstand those shocks. But the summit is all about how do we grow skills and productivity in this economy. Productivity has been sluggish for too long, and productivity in the long term is really how we get economic growth, which means jobs and higher wages. But inequality is something we have to tackle as well. When the people who literally risked their lives during the COVID pandemic, the nurses, the cleaners, the school teachers, when their pay doesn't rise, we have a huge issue. It was okay for me to work from home as a politician, but nurses couldn't, cleaners couldn't, bus drivers couldn't, and yet unless we make sure they're rewarded for their hard effort, that has major implications for our society.
Hi. If each member of the panel had $100 million to spend on the defence budget, how would each panel member apportion that budget towards cyber intelligence or equipment or personnel? And do you think the current mix is appropriate or realistic for the future?
Jacqueline, I'm not sure we'll get around to everyone with the clock running down, but cyber falls into your bailiwick, James Paterson. You've been warning about this for a long time. 100 million mightn't buy us a lot.
Yeah. I was going to say,
but where would you start?
Sadly, 100 million won't get you very far, but in the most recent federal budget, we invested $9.9 billion in effectively doubling the size of the Australian Signals Directorate so that we've got both better defensive capability in the cyber realm, but also offensive cyber capability. And the great thing about cyber capability is it can be deployed much more quickly than a nuclear submarine can. As long as you can hire the people and train them and get them in place, then they're able to have an effect from day one. And it is also an asymmetric capability. When you're thinking about a larger adversary who might be able to do damage to us in the cyber realm, and they're certainly trying to do that right now as we speak, it's important that they know that we can reach out and touch them too, that we could have an impact on them. And the scenario that everyone is particularly worried about is an attempt to disable our critical infrastructure as a prelude to a global or regional crisis, which would destabilise us internally and prevent us from projecting our power into the region to protect our friends or our allies or our values. And that investment will help guard against that risk and also make sure it's a risk for others.
Pat Conroy, the government now has a cybersecurity minister. Sorry, Sharan, I'll just come to you just 1 minute if I could. What can we expect in the budget in terms of a commitment to cybersecurity? We saw the $9.9 billion that the previous government had outlined, but what can we expect?
Well, I'm also the Minister for Defence Industry, so your question is at the heart of one of my tasks. And that's why we've commissioned the Defence Strategic Review, because for the last 50 years, we've had lots of different theories of defence of Australia, forward defence, but our structure of our armed force has been relatively the same. 100 attack-fast fighter jets, 8 to 12 large Navy ships, 6 submarines, 3 brigades, about 60 tanks. So no matter what theory we had roughly the same force. So the Defence Strategic Review is all about what are our threats and what is the correct structure of the ADF, including cyber capability, to combat those threats.
And we can expect a similar commitment?
On cyber, well, that project is being funded right now, and we'll see in March the report coming in from Sir Angus Houston, a very esteemed former Chief of the Defence Force, and Stephen Smith, a former Defence Minister. They'll make some strong recommendations about the structure of the ADF that will accompany our decisions around nuclear-propelled submarines.
Sharan, you wanted to say something?
Well, I want to shift the lens. I'm really worried that we are talking about preparing for war as an inevitability rather than looking at what the global architecture might be to prepare for peace. If you think about it, $100 million is a lot of money, I agree, but it could bring the world together. We meet every year, not hugely successfully, although I'm hoping that's going to change, particularly for Australia, around climate. And it is governments at the highest levels, it is civil society, it's the trade unions, it's the experts in academia. Why do we never bring the world together around the preventative measures for peace? We just released a global report called Our Shared Future with the oldest peace institution, the International Peace Bureau, the Olive Palmer Centre, which actually called for our common security at the height of the Cold War. And we've now joined forces to say we need to go beyond the talk, OK, let's prepare for the worst, but beyond the talk of war and as if it's a deterministic inevitability, and actually bring people together, use the dialogue and the commitment we can generate for peace and for democracy. And I'll finish, Dan, by saying with the democracy question, we've got less than 20% of the world's people, according to Freedom House, who live in genuine democracy, where human rights, labour rights, peace, democratic rights and freedoms exist. Let's bring the world together, do something about that.
Just to pick up on that.
We're almost out of time, so I'll have to say I'll behold Damien and Jennifer just to a minute each. But Damien and then...
just really quickly, just to jump on that. I mean, I think one of the things that we see throughout the region and in a lot of democracies is, frankly, an overinvestment in militarization and an underinvestment in diplomacy. The State Department has so many vacancies in places all over the world because people left under the Trump administration and they haven't been hiring fast enough. And one of the things that I think is true in Australia too, in the Pacific, with all due respect, both your parties have done a terrible job for a very long time if you talk to people in the Pacific. And they say that Australia has been condescending to them for years. So what the world needs to do is get better at diplomacy and more creative with diplomacy. It's still a sclerotic system that doesn't work fast enough when you're competing with China that can get things done in 2 weeks.
Jennifer, final word.
Yeah, so I think, democracy, our institutions need to do better. If we want the rest of the world to come to democracy and, not see authoritarianism as a possibility, then our institutions, our governments need to create jobs, need to provide economic opportunities for the poorest. And I think that's where our systems will be the strongest.
Thank you so much. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Jennifer Sue, Pat Conroy, James Paterson, Damien Cave, and now you can clap, and in Brussels, Sharan Burrow. Once again, a great audience here. Thank you so much for your questions. Can I thank those as well for sharing your stories with us, and to you at home for joining in the conversation. We're coming to you live from Penrith in Western Sydney next week. Of course, a terrible time they've had there with floods and so on in recent months. But on the panel, best-selling author and journalist Johann Hari, Emergency Management and Agriculture Minister Murray Watt, Winnie Dunn from the Sweatshop Literacy Movement, and Archibald Prize-winning artist Black Douglas. Please head to our website and you can register to be in the audience. We'd love to see you, and you can join me on Monday for China Tonight, continuing the conversation we've been having here tonight. Until then, thanks again. Good night.